Hello and welcome to the Learn English Lab. I'm Mike, and I am so glad you could join us for this deep dive into something that's incredibly useful. How to discuss your financial goals in English.
Yeah, that's a really great topic. It can be a little bit, intimidating to talk about finances, especially in another language. I'm Sarah, and I'm excited to kind of break down this process for you.
That's a great point. I think a lot of people feel that way. So can you imagine confidently talking about investments, or maybe negotiating a business deal, or even just chatting with friends about your financial hopes and dreams, all in English? That's really what we're aiming for in this deep dive, right?
Absolutely. And, it's not just about knowing the words, the vocabulary, although that is super important. It's also about gaining the confidence to navigate real-life financial conversations in English. In different contexts.
Okay, so let's talk about why this is so valuable. What kind of opportunities open up when you can comfortably discuss your financial goals in English?
Well, Mike, English is often the language of global finance and international collaboration, right? So by mastering the skill, you're really opening doors to a world of possibilities. Things like securing loans from international institutions or collaborating with partners across the globe.
That's a fantastic point. It's about expanding your horizons and equipping yourself to really thrive in a globalized world. So how do we start this journey?
Well, let's lay a good foundation, right? Some fundamental vocabulary. So let's think about those basic terms that we use every day when we talk about money. Things like budget, income, expenses, savings.
Okay. Those are familiar even to someone like me who's still learning.
Right.
But how do we use these words, effectively in a conversation?
Okay, so let's take the word budget, for example, right? If you're talking to a friend about your spending habits, you could say something like, hey, I'm trying to create a monthly budget to save for a trip to Europe, right? So it clearly conveys that you're actively managing your money to achieve a specific goal.
That's a really great example. It's simple, it's clear, it's relatable. Now, what about income? How can we use that word naturally?
Imagine you just got a promotion at work, right? You could tell a colleague, my income has increased since my promotion, so I'm finally able to start investing. This shows you understand income as the money you earn from your job.
Perfect. Now let's tackle everybody's favorite topic, expenses. How do we bring those up without, sounding negative?
Okay. You could frame it in a positive way, right? You could say, I'm trying to reduce my monthly expenses by cutting back on eating out so I can afford to take a language course. This highlights, that you're making conscious choices to prioritize what's important to you.
I like how you turn that potentially negative topic into a really positive statement about, personal growth. And finally, let's not forget savings, the cornerstone of financial well-being, right? So how do we explain this concept in English?
You could say, I'm committed to putting a portion of my income into savings each month to build a safety net for unexpected events. This demonstrates that you're thinking long-term and prioritizing financial security.
Excellent. So we've covered some of the basics, but I know there's so much more to explore when it comes to discussing specific financial goals, right?
Absolutely. We need to expand our vocabulary, right?
Yeah.
And delve into the language of short-term and long-term goals. These terms help us differentiate between, those immediate desires and those bigger, life-changing aspirations.
Yeah, yes. It's like the difference between getting that fancy coffee today versus, planning for a comfortable retirement decades from now. So how do we explain these distinct goals in English?
Okay, so let's say you're aiming to pay off a small debt quickly, right? You could say, my short-term goal is to pay off my credit card balance within the next 3 months. So that specific time frame emphasizes the immediate nature of this objective.
That's clear and concise. Now let's shift gears to a larger aspiration. How would you describe a long-term goal, like, say, buying a home?
You could say, my long-term goal is to purchase a house within the next 5 years. So again, that time frame clarifies the extended nature of this ambition.
Okay, I'm starting to feel like I could actually articulate my own financial goals with more confidence. But achieving these big dreams, whether short-term or long-term, often involves hitting smaller targets along the way, right? So how do we talk about these milestones in English?
Okay, imagine you're saving to start your own business. You could say, reaching $5,000 in savings is a significant milestone towards my goal of launching my own company. This shows that the milestone is a stepping stone toward a larger vision.
It's like breaking down a marathon into those manageable segments. Now let's talk about growing our money. This brings us to the exciting world of investments, which sometimes can feel like a whole new language.
It can be, but with a few key terms, you'll be able to navigate this terrain confidently. So let's start with the word invest itself. You could say, I'm considering investing in mutual funds to potentially grow my savings faster.
Okay, that's a good start. But what about the potential rewards and, of course, the risks that come with investing?
That's where the term return comes in. You could say, I'm hoping for a solid return on my investments, but I understand there are risks involved.
And how do we explain that concept of risk in a way that makes sense?
Simply put, you could say, I'm aware that higher potential returns usually come with higher risks. It's a straightforward way to acknowledge that investing involves a balance, between potential gains and losses.
That makes sense. It's all about finding that balance between risk and reward. Now, when we talk about our investments as a whole, what's the term that we use?
We call that our portfolio. You could say, I'm working with a financial advisor to diversify my investment portfolio across different asset classes. This demonstrates a strategic approach to managing your investments.
This is fantastic. We're building a solid vocabulary for talking about investments. But let's be real, sometimes our financial goals involve managing something a bit less exciting: debt. So how can we comfortably discuss this topic in English?
It's true that debt can be a sensitive subject, but it's crucial to be able to discuss it openly and honestly. So let's say you're focused on paying down a student loan. You could say, I'm diligently paying down my student loan debt to achieve financial freedom sooner. So this showcases a proactive approach to managing your debt.
Right. And how do we use terms like loan and interest in conversation? They always seem to trip me up.
Okay, so for loan, you could say, I took out a small personal loan to cover some unexpected medical expenses. This clearly explains that you borrowed money for a specific purpose.
And interest. That one always seems so complicated.
Well, think of it as the cost of borrowing money. You could say, the interest rate on my loan is quite high, so I'm making extra payments to pay it off quickly.
Okay, that's a much clearer way to explain it. And speaking of important financial concepts, let's not forget about credit. Seems like credit scores play a major role in the English-speaking financial world. So how do we bring up this topic naturally?
Imagine you're planning to buy a house in the future. You could say, I'm working on building my credit score so I can qualify for a mortgage with a favorable interest rate. This demonstrates, that you understand the importance of establishing good credit.
This is so incredibly helpful. We've covered so much ground already, from basic terms to investments and even debt.
Yeah.
But how do we actually put these words together into smooth flowing sentences and conversations?
Well, that's where the power of phrases comes in. We need to move beyond individual words and explore some key expressions that will help you confidently navigate different stages of a financial discussion. Are you ready to take it to the next level?
Absolutely. Let's dive into the art of crafting those perfect phrases for financial conversations in English. Okay, I'm ready. How do we start these conversations?
Well, think about those casual conversations you might have with friends or colleagues. You could ease into it by saying something like, hey, I've been thinking a lot about my financial future lately. Have you given much thought to your own goals?
Okay, that's a good way to open the door without feeling too pushy. It kind of invites the other person to share if they're comfortable. So once we've, kind of sparked that interest, how do we actually articulate our goals clearly?
Well, specificity is key. Instead of just saying, oh, I want to save more, give some concrete details. Like you could say, my main goal is to save $15,000 in the next 2 years for a down payment on a condo. The numbers and the time frame really paint a clear picture of your ambition.
I like how you made it measurable and tangible. It's not just some vague desire, it's an actual plan. So what if we're feeling a little lost and we want to get some advice from someone with more experience? How can we politely ask for advice?
Well, you could frame it as a request for their insights, right? Recognizing their expertise. You could say something like, I'm really impressed with how you've managed your finances. Would you be willing to share any tips on how I could reach my goal?
That's a great approach. It acknowledges their knowledge while expressing, your own willingness to learn. So what about when someone asks us about our own finances? How do we respond thoughtfully without feeling obligated to overshare?
You can definitely strike a balance there. Acknowledge their question, but maintain some privacy. So you could say, that's a good question. I'm still kind of exploring different options, but I'll definitely keep you posted. It allows you to deflect without feeling pressured.
These are really useful phrases. I feel much more equipped to handle those tricky conversations. But let's not forget about the backbone of any language, grammar. So how do we make sure we're using the right tenses and structures when discussing financial matters?
Oh, that's a crucial point. Clear grammar is so important to make sure your message is understood accurately, especially when you're talking about something as important as finances. So let's start with the present tense. We use that to discuss our current habits and routines. For instance, you could say, I typically allocate about 30% of my income towards rent each month.
Okay, so the present tense helps us paint a picture of our current financial habits. What about when we're talking about our aspirations for the future?
Well, then you would use the future tense. Imagine you're talking about retirement plans. You could say, I will start contributing more to my retirement fund once I receive my annual bonus. So using will signals a clear intention for the future.
And if we want to reflect on past financial experiences, what tense would we use then?
You would naturally use the past tense to describe completed actions. Like, last year I successfully paid off all my outstanding credit card debt.
This is all making a lot of sense. What about when we want to explore hypothetical situations or different possibilities?
That's when you would use conditional sentences. Let's say you're considering investing in the stock market. You could say, if the market continues to perform well, I would consider investing a portion of my savings. So you're using if to introduce a condition and would to express a potential action.
Okay. These grammar tips are fantastic. I feel like I'm gaining a much deeper understanding of how to structure sentences. But sometimes, even with the right vocabulary and grammar, I still feel like my conversations lack structure. It's like, I have all the ingredients, but I can't bake the cake.
I get it. It's so easy to get sidetracked or ramble, especially when you're talking about complex topics like finance. That's why having a simple framework to organize your thoughts can be incredibly helpful.
Okay, I'm ready for the recipe for a well-structured financial conversation. What's the first ingredient?
Start with a clear introduction. Let the person know why you're bringing this up. You could say something like, I've been reevaluating my financial priorities, and I would appreciate your insights on planning for the future. So it kind of sets the context and signals your intention.
Okay, that sets a great foundation. What comes next?
Once you've introduced the topic, articulate your specific goals. Use those measurable details we talked about earlier. You might say, my primary objective is to save $25,000 over the next 3 years for a down payment on a house.
That's crystal clear. What's the next step in building this framework?
After stating your goals, outline your plan. How do you intend to achieve them? For example, you could say, to reach this goal, I'm going to increase my monthly savings by $200 and explore ways to generate passive income.
It's like a roadmap to success. But what about those challenges, that pop up along the way? How do we address those in a conversation?
Don't shy away from them. Acknowledge those potential obstacles. It shows that you've thought things through. You could say, I know it might be tempting to, splurge on unnecessary things, but I'm determined to stay disciplined and focused on my goal.
That's a great strategy. Anticipate the hurdles and have a plan. So is there anything else we should keep in mind when structuring these conversations?
Absolutely. If you're seeking advice, conclude by inviting the other person to share their thoughts. You could say something like, what are your thoughts on this approach? I'd really value your perspective. It shows that you're open to learning from their experiences.
This framework is so helpful. It really provides a clear path. But there's one more element that can really impact how our message is received, especially in different cultures: cultural awareness.
You're absolutely right. Cultural nuances play a huge role in how we communicate, especially when we're discussing sensitive topics like money.
So let's explore some key cultural considerations to keep in mind. What's the first thing we should be mindful of?
Well, in many English-speaking cultures, while directness is valued, a bit of politeness and tact goes a long way, especially when talking about money. So instead of bluntly saying, I need a raise, you could phrase it more diplomatically, like, I'd like to discuss my salary expectations in light of my recent contributions.
That's a much more nuanced approach. It focuses on collaboration rather than making demands. What other cultural nuances should we be aware of?
Avoid bragging or boasting about your financial achievements. Humility is generally appreciated. So instead of saying, I made a fortune, you could simply say, I've been fortunate with some of my investments.
That's a good reminder. It's about expressing gratitude without sounding arrogant. So any other essential cultural tips?
Yes. Respect other people's privacy. It's considered rude to pry into their income or spending habits unless they specifically invite you to do so. So remember, financial matters are often seen as personal.
Those are all really insightful points. Cultural awareness is so essential for building trust. But I know for many of our listeners, learning English as a second language, the idea of putting all this into practice can still feel daunting.
Of course. It's natural to feel nervous speaking a new language, especially when it comes to something as personal as money. But remember, fluency comes with practice and patience.
So what are some practical tips for overcoming these challenges that non-native speakers might face? Let's start with pronunciation. Those tricky English words can be real tongue twisters.
Absolutely. One helpful technique is to break down longer words into syllables. For example, the word budget, you can break it down into budget. Practice each syllable separately and then blend them together. And don't be afraid to exaggerate the sounds at first. It helps train your tongue.
That's a good tip. Breaking things down can make them feel much less intimidating. So what about when we feel overwhelmed by those complex financial concepts? How can we simplify things?
Well, instead of using all that technical jargon, try explaining things in plain language as if you were talking to a friend who isn't familiar with those terms. For example, instead of saying, I'm diversifying my investment portfolio, you could say, I'm spreading my money across different types of investments so I don't lose everything if one of them doesn't do well.
Okay, that's much more relatable.
Yeah.
Breaks it down into simple everyday language.
Exactly. And don't be afraid to ask for clarification. If you hear a word you don't know, just ask. Most people are happy to explain things in simpler terms. Remember, learning is a two-way street.
Asking questions is such an important part of learning. It shows you're engaged. So for our listeners who are feeling really motivated and want to take their financial English to the next level, what recommendations do you have?
One fun way to enrich your vocabulary is to learn some common idioms related to money.
Ooh, I love idioms. They add so much personality to the language. Can you give us some examples?
Sure. Let's take the idiom, tighten your belt. It means to reduce your spending, you live more frugally. You could say, with the recent increase in gas prices, we've had to tighten our belts and cut back on unnecessary expenses.
That really paints a vivid picture. It's like understanding a cultural concept in one phrase. What other tips do you have for taking our financial English to that next level?
Immerse yourself in authentic content. Explore books, podcasts, or even financial news websites that use real-life examples of financial language. It's a great way to absorb new vocabulary naturally.
That's a great idea. Surrounding yourself with the language can accelerate your learning.
And remember, don't be afraid to make mistakes. It's all part of the process. Embrace those mistakes as opportunities to grow.
That's such an empowering message. It's about viewing mistakes as stepping stones. So before we move on to our final segment, what's one piece of advice you would offer to those listeners who are maybe still hesitant or unsure about discussing their financial goals?
I would say believe in yourself. Learning a new language, especially one as nuanced as English, it takes time and dedication. Be kind to yourself, celebrate those small victories, and never stop pushing yourself to grow.
That's fantastic. It's about cultivating a positive mindset and embracing the journey. So let's move on to our final segment where we'll explore this powerful concept that connects our financial goals with our deeper values. Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into discussing financial goals in English, I want to go back to something you mentioned earlier about aligning our financial goals with our values. It's such an important concept.
It really is. It's about recognizing that money is more than just numbers. It's a tool that can help us, build a life that reflects what truly matters to us.
I really love that perspective. It's not just about, getting rich. It's about making choices that support the kind of life we want.
Precisely. Think of your financial goals as stepping stones that kind of lead you towards, your ideal life. Each goal should be aligned with those core values, those beliefs that shape your priorities and guide your choices.
That's a beautiful way to think about it. So how can our listeners start to connect their financial goals with their values? Sounds like a pretty in-depth process.
It can be, but it's so rewarding.
Yeah.
Start by taking some time for self-reflection. Ask yourself some key questions like, what brings you joy and fulfillment? What impact do you want to make on the world? What kind of legacy do you want to leave behind?
Wow, those are some really thought-provoking questions. They make you really think about what matters.
Exactly. And once you have a better understanding of your values, you can start to align your financial goals with them. Your money becomes a way to support the life you envision.
Can you give us some specific examples of how someone's values might actually influence their financial decisions? I'd love to see how this works in real life.
Of course. So let's say someone really values family and togetherness. Their financial goals might be all about creating a loving environment for their loved ones. They might prioritize saving for their children's education, or investing in a comfortable home, or planning those memorable family vacations.
That makes total sense. Their financial decisions are supporting their desire to create a strong family life. What about someone who values adventure and new experiences? How would that translate into financial goals?
Well, they might prioritize saving for travel, investing in experiences rather than material things, or even, pursuing a career that offers flexibility and the ability to travel. Their goals become a way to fuel their passion for exploring the world.
I see how their choices reflect their desire for growth and new experiences.
Mm-hmm.
What about someone who's passionate about making a difference in the world? how can their values guide them?
Well, they might choose to donate a portion of their income to charity, or invest in companies that align with their ethical beliefs, or even start their own business that addresses a social or environmental problem.
It's incredible how our values can impact not just our personal lives, but also our financial decisions. It's about finding that connection where our money supports the things we deeply care about.
It really is.
Yeah.
And remember, our values can change over time as we grow and learn. That's completely normal. The important thing is to check in with ourselves every now and then, reassess our values, and make sure our goals are still aligned with what's important to us.
That's a great reminder. It's about being intentional with our money so that it helps us create a life that we truly love.
Absolutely. It's about creating a life that feels authentic and fulfilling, both financially and personally.
Well said. This has been such an insightful and empowering conversation. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise on discussing financial goals in English and for reminding us about the connection between our values and our financial choices.
It's been my pleasure. I hope our listeners feel confident and ready to navigate financial conversations in English.
And to all of our amazing listeners, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive. We hope you've gained some valuable insights and practical tools to help you articulate your aspirations with more clarity and confidence. Remember, practice makes progress, so keep challenging yourself and celebrate those small wins along the way. And if you enjoyed this episode, please like, share, and subscribe to our YouTube channel for more deep dives into essential English skills. We'll be back soon with more tips and strategies to help you achieve your language learning goals. Until then, keep learning, keep growing, and keep striving toward the life of your dreams. Okay, so you guys have sent in quite a bit of stuff for us to take a look at about how English learners can speak in a way that people actually want to listen to.
Yeah.
So we have this guide here that's specifically tailored to that topic.
It's a pretty comprehensive one, too.
Yeah, it is. It's really fascinating. And I think it goes beyond just your typical, grammar and vocabulary.
Yeah.
Like how to structure a sentence.
It's really about connection and like the emotion in your voice and...
Right.
Yeah.
How you come across as a speaker.
Exactly. It's more than just the words. It's the whole package.
Exactly. And so in this deep dive, we are going to pull out some of the most, I think, effective strategies from this guide that you guys have shared with us, and hopefully give you some things that you can really use.
Yeah, and what I like about this guide too is that it's very much a step-by-step journey. It gives you tools and examples along the way, and it's really geared towards kind of like a transformation of your speaking skills.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's jump into it with, I guess what I would say is probably the most fundamental aspect of any speaker, but especially if you're dealing with a second language, and that is confidence.
Yeah, I mean, the guide really nails it when it says that confidence is not about perfection.
Right.
It's about being comfortable with your own voice.
Yeah.
And that comfort shines through.
Yeah.
And, really influences how the other person perceives you.
Absolutely. And I think as an English learner, you probably deal with this maybe even more so than a native speaker.
Of course, yeah.
Where you're worried about your accent.
Yeah.
You're worried about maybe grammatical errors and stuff.
Totally.
And I think that the guide really addresses that and saying, it's not about being perfect. It's about being comfortable.
Yeah. Yeah.
In your own voice. And the guide also talks about accepting your accent.
It does.
And not looking at that as a crutch or...
Yeah, as a negative thing.
Yeah, as a negative thing, but as actually something that's a part of your identity.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it even says, to practice saying,
this is cool.
I'm proud of my voice.
Oh, I love that.
And I think that that's a really powerful shift in thinking.
It is. And, I read some research that suggests that actually when you're less anxious about your accent, you tend to speak more fluently.
I can see that.
And then people actually focus on the message rather than on how you're saying it.
Totally.
Yeah.
Okay, so the guide also suggests that, you start small,
Yeah.
You maybe talk to yourself in English, you record yourself to kind of get more familiar with your own sound.
I do that all the time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You talk to friends that are supportive, that understand that you're learning English.
Right, that are patient with you.
Yeah. And so, and then it also goes on to talk about preparation.
Yeah.
So if you have some kind of event coming up, whether it's a presentation or an interview.
Anything like that.
Or you're going to meet someone that that you want to make a good impression on, or whatever it is. To actually take the time to maybe rehearse a little.
Totally.
And to write down some key phrases or...
I just have some idea.
An outline or whatever.
Of what you want to talk about.
Yeah. And that's something that I do a lot too.
Yeah.
Just to kind of...
Just so you're not...
So I'm not standing
You're completely lost.
Yeah,
like a deer in the headlights.
Yeah, totally. And it also mentions, and I think this is something that we can all relate to, is like when you get nervous,
Yeah.
you know, and so it even suggests the physical act of taking deep breaths
Oh, yeah, that's a huge one.
to kind of steady your voice.
Absolutely.
And that's, I think probably most of us know that, but we don't always think about it.
No, we don't.
Yeah.
We forget to breathe.
Yeah, exactly.
Especially when we're nervous.
Exactly. And there's even a practice, exercise or something that it suggests to do, where you stand in front of a mirror and you say, I have something important to say, and I know people want to hear it, and to repeat that, but with increasing energy each time,
That's great.
which I thought was really interesting.
I like that.
Yeah.
It's about like embodying that belief.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I guess seeing yourself as a confident speaker
Right.
is really helpful.
Yeah. And I think that, building confidence, it's not something that you're just going to
Right.
do overnight.
Yeah.
It's something that you have to kind of work on and cultivate.
Yeah, it's a process.
And so all these little things, I think, can help to build up to that.
Yeah, they really can.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, so moving on from confidence, the next thing that this guide addresses is clarity.
Right.
And it even calls clarity your superpower.
I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Which I thought was really cool.
I mean, it's true, though.
Yeah.
You can have the most brilliant ideas in the world, but if you can't articulate them,
Nobody's going to know.
yeah, nobody's going to understand what you're trying to say, and they're going to lose interest pretty quickly.
Right. And I think that shows a respect for your listeners. Hey,
Particularly
you're trying to
not waste their time.
not waste their time.
Yeah.
Be
clear and concise.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the tips that it suggests is, and it's kind of a fundamental one that I think a lot of people maybe overlook, but it is to slow down,
Yeah.
which when you're trying to formulate sentences in a second language, I think it can be really easy to kind of
Rush through it.
speed up because you're trying to get it all out
Yeah, get it out
before you forget it.
before you forget it.
And so it says to slow down and then also to pause after sentences
Right.
to let the listener kind of absorb what you just said.
Exactly. Give them time to process.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it also mentions pronunciation
Yeah.
and, focusing on some of the sounds in English that are particularly challenging, like to thee,
Yeah.
the R, the elmi. Yeah. And it even suggests practicing minimal pairs.
Right.
So like think versus sink.
That's a good one.
Yeah, or bat versus bet.
Mm-hmm.
And so these minimal pairs will help you to really distinguish between the phonemes, the actual sound.
The sounds, yeah, that differentiate meaning.
Right.
Yeah.
Because if you say the wrong one, then,
You could say something completely different.
you change the meaning.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the other thing that the guide mentions is using simple indirect language.
Right.
There's no need to use these big fancy words.
Keep it simple.
Yeah. Happy is just as effective as ecstatic,
Yeah.
in most situations.
Yeah. And sometimes simpler is actually
Right.
clearer.
It's clear. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I also like the technique that it suggests where it talks about rephrasing important points.
Yeah.
So you're not just repeating the same thing over and over again,
Right.
but you're saying it in slightly different words,
Mm.
which can help to kind of solidify the understanding for the listener.
Exactly.
And I thought the example that it gave was really good. I believe teamwork is essential.
Mm-hmm.
Collaborating effectively leads to better outcomes. So it's the same.
It's the same idea,
Yeah.
but said in two different ways.
Yeah. And I think particularly for people who are listening in a second language,
Yeah.
it's not their native language.
Yeah.
That kind of redundancy is really helpful.
Yeah, totally.
Absolutely. And then of course the classic, practice exercise.
Yeah.
The quick brown fox jumps over the lazy dog.
It's a classic for a reason.
Yeah, it's a staple.
Yeah.
And, it forces you to articulate
Right.
every single sound.
Yeah. It uses all the sounds of the English language.
It does.
Yeah.
Yeah. So, okay. So, we've talked about clear speech, but then the guide goes on to another really interesting point, and that is using your voice like a musical instrument,
Yeah.
which I thought was cool.
Yeah, I love that idea. Because it really emphasizes that how you say something
Right.
is just as important as what you're saying.
Totally.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, if you think about someone who's speaking in a monotone,
Right. So boring.
it's just hard to listen to.
Yeah.
And so the guide contrasts that with someone who's speaking with variation in their voice,
Right.
and it talks about some specific techniques that you can use, like varying your pitch,
Yeah.
to indicate different emotions.
Yeah.
So, you might have a higher pitch if you're expressing excitement
Yeah.
and a lower pitch if you're trying to convey something more serious.
Yeah.
And it even gives the example of, I can't believe it,
Right.
saying that in a high pitch and saying that in a low pitch.
It changes the meaning completely.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it's just being aware of that, I think, is really,
Yeah, just noticing how you sound.
yeah.
Yeah.
And, also adjusting your volume,
Oh, yeah.
not to the point of shouting, but using it in a way that, strategically,
Yeah.
to grab attention or maybe to draw people in.
Right, like if you're telling a secret or something like that,
Exactly.
you lower your voice.
Yeah. And then it also mentions using pauses.
Pauses are so important.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think that's something that as speakers.
I think we forget about them a lot.
Yeah.
Because we're so focused on the words.
Right.
But silence can actually be
Right.
really powerful
Yeah.
when it comes to speaking.
Absolutely. And so, like pausing before you say something really important,
Yeah.
or pausing after to kind of let it sink in.
Exactly.
And the example that it gives is, I have an idea,
Da da da.
and then a pause.
Yeah.
It could change everything.
Oh, I like that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think also aligning your vocal tone
Mm-hmm.
with the emotion that you're expressing.
Right. So if you're saying something sad,
Right.
you don't want to sound happy,
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to be genuine,
Exactly. Yeah.
be authentic. Exactly. And it gives the example of like telling a friend about a trip you took
Yeah.
and how naturally you're going to kind of go up and down with your pitch.
Yeah.
And you're going to pause and you're going to,
Vary your volume.
vary your volume. And it's like you're almost doing it subconsciously,
Right.
but it's so effective,
Yeah.
and so I think that's something that we can all kind of learn from.
Absolutely.
Okay, so moving on to, I think, a really fun part of the guide, which is storytelling.
This is one of my favorites.
Yeah, and it suggests that, storytelling is a powerful tool
Oh, yeah.
because as humans, we love stories.
Yeah, we're drawn to them.
Yeah, and we remember things better when they're told in the form of a story.
Absolutely.
And so rather than just stating facts,
Right.
it's better to kind of illustrate those facts.
With an anecdote or something.
Yeah, with a story.
Yeah.
And so it gives the example of, instead of just saying, I'm a hard worker,
Right.
which
is boring.
is kind of boring. Yeah. Tell me about a time when you worked really hard.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And you stayed late to finish a project or something like that.
Yeah, exactly.
All right.
And so I think that that's something that, we can all kind of try to incorporate.
It makes it relatable. If you're just saying I'm hardworking,
Right.
it's like, okay.
Doesn't mean anything.
Yeah, but if you tell a story, people can connect with that.
Exactly. And the guide also kind of breaks down, what makes a good story.
Yeah.
Starting with a hook,
Right.
to really grab the listener's attention.
Grab them from the beginning.
Yeah, from the beginning. And it gives an example of a weak hook
Right.
and then a strong hook
Yeah.
to kind of show you the difference.
Show the contrast.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it also mentions keeping the language simple,
Yeah.
so using short sentences, basic words. You don't have to use all these big fancy words.
Yeah. Don't try to be too complicated.
Yeah, when you're telling a story.
Yeah, just let the story speak for itself.
Right. And then also to weave in emotional depth. So to actually share how you felt
Right.
during the events of the story.
That's what makes it engaging.
Yeah, because that's how the listener's going to
Connect.
connect.
And feel what you felt.
Yeah, empathize with your experience.
Yeah.
And then finally, concluding with a clear takeaway
Right.
that relates back to the point that you're trying to make.
It shouldn't just be a random story.
Right.
It should have a purpose.
Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah.
And then it suggests, a little practice story. So to tell a 3-sentence story.
That's a good one.
Yeah, about a personal experience. So it's, something simple like,
Yeah.
spilling coffee on yourself or
Missing the bus.
missing the bus or whatever.
That's great. Yeah.
Yeah. And to actually practice telling it.
Out loud.
Yeah. Out loud.
Yeah.
And to really try to convey
The feeling.
the feeling.
Yeah.
Okay, so we're building confidence. We're speaking clearly. We're using our voice. We're telling stories. What's the next thing?
Connecting with your audience.
Okay.
Yeah. And this is all about making the listener feel seen and understood.
I love that.
Yeah. It's about making it a two-way street.
Right. It's not just, I'm up here speaking.
Yeah. It's a conversation.
Yeah.
And you're acknowledging that there's someone else
Right.
in the room.
Yeah. And I think that makes you as a speaker, warmer,
It does.
more real.
More human.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And it says that, a speaker who ignores their audience
Yeah.
is going to come across as distant,
Right.
and someone who actually tries to connect,
Is it going to be much more engaging?
yeah, it's going to be much more engaging.
Right.
And so it suggests some strategies for doing that, knowing your audience
Right.
and using language that's relevant to them.
Yeah.
So, if you're talking to children, you're going to use different language and examples than if you're talking to adults.
Of course. Yeah.
Yeah. And, asking questions,
Oh, yeah.
which I think is so huge
That's so important.
because it shows that you're actually,
That you care
you care about what they think.
what they think. Yeah.
Even if you don't get a verbal response,
Right.
it's still like,
It makes them think.
it makes them think.
And it makes them feel like you care
Yeah.
about their opinion.
Totally.
Okay.
And it also suggests using the pronoun you,
Oh, yeah.
which again, I think is so powerful.
It is.
Because it makes it personal.
Yeah, you can achieve this
Right.
is much better
Right.
than people can achieve this.
Yeah. It's like you're speaking directly
Right. To that person.
to them.
Yeah.
Yeah. And of course, smiling,
Yeah.
making eye contact.
Body language is huge.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And I love the example that it gives where it talks about framing a difficulty that you encountered, in learning English
Yeah.
by saying, how hard English can be, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
I struggle with this too.
Right.
But here's what helped me.
Sharing that experience.
Yeah. And I think that makes you as a speaker so relatable,
It does.
because you're
Yeah.
showing that you're
human.
human.
You've been there.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. So, you're connecting with your audience, and then the guide kind of shifts gears a little bit and talks about being concise,
Right.
And I think this is so valuable
It is.
because people's, minds wander.
They do,
It's-
especially nowadays.
Yeah.
Everyone's so busy.
Yeah. And short, sharp ideas, I think are more impactful.
They are.
And it contrasts that with, I think the tendency for some English learners to kind of over-explain,
Right.
and I think sometimes it's because,
We're so worried about
Yeah.
being understood
yeah,
that we
you
go
overboard.
We go overboard.
Yeah.
Yeah, and so it suggests some really good techniques for being more concise.
Yeah.
Starting with, planning what you're going to say before you say it.
Right. Have that one main point.
Yeah, and sticking to that one point.
Yeah. And then, cutting out unnecessary words,
Yes.
and so I'm tired versus I'm feeling very exhausted right now.
Right. Much simpler.
Much simpler.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then also using examples instead of lengthy explanations.
Right.
So like I worked all night
Yeah.
versus I was engaged in numerous tasks
Yeah.
throughout the entirety of the night and consequently did not have the opportunity to sleep.
Exactly. Nobody wants to hear that.
Nobody wants to hear all that.
Yeah.
Yeah. And then also, knowing when to stop speaking.
Yes.
Once you've made your point.
That's a tough one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But it's so important.
It is.
Yeah. And then he gives this practice, exercise where you say,
Okay.
I love learning English because it opens doors.
I like that one.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And to try to say that in one breath.
Right. Because if you start adding all these extra words,
Yeah.
it loses its power.
It loses its power.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. So now we're getting into the, even if you do all of this, you're still going to make mistakes,
Oh, yeah.
especially if you're speaking English as a second language.
Of course.
And so the guide addresses that.
It does.
And it starts out by saying, mistakes are normal.
They're part of the process.
Yeah. And what really matters is how you handle them.
That's what people remember.
Right. And it says that, listeners are generally forgiving,
They are.
and that they admire effort more than perfection,
Absolutely.
and I think that that's so important to keep in mind
It is.
because we can be so hard on ourselves.
we're our own worst critics.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it gives some, tips for recovering gracefully,
Yeah.
so staying calm,
Right.
pausing, maybe smiling,
Yeah.
and then just correcting the error directly.
Yeah. Just say it again.
And so like I got,
Right.
and then I went,
Exactly.
Work that.
Simple as that.
yeah. And it also suggests, maybe using some humor
Yeah.
to kind of lighten the situation.
Yeah. Like, oh, English is tricky,
Yeah.
something like that.
Yeah. And I think that can really help to kind of,
Diffuse the tension.
yeah.
Yeah.
And then just continuing on.
Yeah. Don't dwell on it.
Don't dwell on it.
Yeah.
And then it also says, to learn from the mistake privately later,
Right.
so that you can continue to improve.
Yeah. Don't beat yourself up about it, but just make a mental note.
Yeah. And I love the example that it gives, which is correcting yourself mid-sentence.
Yeah.
So yesterday I see I saw a great movie.
Yeah, that's perfect.
You know, it's like just,
You caught yourself.
Yeah.
And you fixed it.
yeah, and it's no big deal.
No big deal.
Yeah. Okay, so finally, the guide talks about the importance of practice.
Of course, practice makes perfect.
Yeah, and it says that, great speaking, just like any other skill,
Yeah.
is developed through practice,
Absolutely.
and that repetition builds habits.
It does.
And so it makes speaking easier over time.
It becomes more natural.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And so it suggests some, daily practice methods,
Okay.
like talking to yourself in English,
Yeah.
which I do all the time,
I do too.
describing your daily activities aloud.
So people think you're crazy, but it's
Yeah.
helpful.
Copying native speakers.
Yeah.
So finding videos.
Of people that you admire
Yeah.
and copying their tone and rhythm.
Yeah.
TED Talks are great for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then also joining conversations, with friends, classmates, or, online language exchange platforms.
Like Hello Talk.
Yeah, like Hello Talk or Tandem or whatever.
Yeah, there's so many options now.
Yeah.
It's amazing.
And then setting achievable goals,
Right.
So, maybe starting with 5 minutes a day.
Yeah, start small.
Yeah, and gradually increasing that.
And then build up from there.
Yeah, and I like the example daily routine that it gives. Maybe in the morning you express gratitude in English,
That's a good one.
and then in the afternoon maybe you read a news headline out loud, and then in the evening you tell a short story,
That's perfect.
or whatever.
Yeah.
So it's just kind of like breaking it down into manageable chunks.
Yeah.
And
And
then-
making it part of your routine
Yeah,
so it's not so overwhelming.
right.
Yeah.
So it's really a comprehensive roadmap, I think, for speaking English effectively.
It is. It covers everything.
Yeah. And so, as the listener, we really encourage you to start implementing these strategies.
Yeah, even in small ways.
Yeah.
Just pick one and start today.
Yeah,
And just notice the difference.
Right. Absolutely. And I think as you continue on your journey, with learning English, maybe think about which of these areas
Yeah.
that we discussed, the confidence, the clarity, the using your voice, the storytelling, the connection, the conciseness, the how you handle mistakes, the practicing.
Yeah.
Which one of those do you think is like your biggest opportunity for growth right now?
That's a great question.
Yeah, and focus on that,
Yeah.
in your next English conversation and just see.
And see what happens,
Yeah.
how it changes the interaction.
Yeah, I think that's really powerful.
It is. Yeah.
Yeah,
So good luck
absolutely.
out there.
All right.
Happy speaking.
Oh, thanks. Hey everyone, and welcome back to the Deep Dive. Today we're getting into something I think a lot of you are really interested in, and that's how we talk about yoga and mindfulness, in English.
Yeah, it's fascinating, right?
Totally. I mean,
Yeah.
whether you're a newbie, curious about like a pose or how to meditate, or you've been practicing for ages and want to like really express yourself more clearly, this is for you.
It is.
In this deep dive, we're going to equip you with the language and the confidence to discuss these amazing practices, with ease. We've gone through tons of info to bring you the most important and interesting bits.
Yeah, and what's really cool to think about is how these ancient traditions, yoga and mindfulness, have become so global.
They really have.
Yoga, it started in India over 5,000 years ago. It combines these beautiful physical postures, asanas, with breathing exercises, pranayama, and meditation.
Right. It's all about that harmony of body and mind.
Exactly. And mindfulness, which comes from Buddhist teachings, focuses on being present right here, right now.
So simple, yet so powerful.
And because they're so popular, especially in English-speaking countries, English has become like the main language for talking about them.
That makes sense.
So, by becoming fluent in this language, you're not just learning words, you're unlocking a deeper understanding. You can connect with people across the world, which is amazing.
Okay, so let's build that foundation. We'll start with some essential vocab, right? Those yoga poses, the asanas. You'll hear both the English and Sanskrit names, and knowing both is super helpful.
Yeah, it shows a deeper understanding.
Take downward facing dog, or Adho Mukha Svanasana. It's that inverted V shape, and it's amazing for stretching your hamstrings.
It really is.
You could say to someone, I love how downward facing dog stretches my hamstrings.
Exactly.
Then there's Warrior 2, Virabhadrasana second. Standing strong, arms extended, legs wide, you feel powerful and grounded.
It's a pose that embodies strength.
You could say Warrior 2 makes me feel strong and grounded.
It's interesting, isn't it, how the physical pose reflects the intention behind it?
Yeah, I've never thought about it like that.
Then you've got tree pose, Vrksasana. You're balancing on one leg, the other foot resting on your thigh. That one really tests your focus.
It does.
You could say, tree pose really challenges my focus. And then, there's child's pose, Balasana, knees tucked in, forehead to the ground, total relaxation after a tough sequence.
Love child's pose.
It's a favorite, right?
Total favorite. I always relax in child's pose after a tough sequence. And yeah, knowing both the English and Sanskrit names is awesome.
It shows that connection.
It really does. And let's not forget the equipment. We've got the yoga mat, the cushioned, grippy surface we all rely on. You could say, I just bought a new yoga mat. It's so grippy.
Yeah.
Then there are the blocks, foam, or cork rectangles.
So helpful.
They're great for support in poses like triangle pose. Using a block helps me reach the floor in triangle pose. Then we have the strap, like an extension of your arm. So helpful for seated forward bends.
They make a big difference.
A strap makes seated forward bends easier. And of course, the bolster, that firm pillow that makes restorative poses so blissful.
Oh yeah, those are amazing.
The bolster felt amazing during my relaxation pose.
It's interesting when you think about how all these props help you explore the poses more deeply or safely.
Right.
They adapt the pose to what your body needs that day, which is key.
So true. Okay, so we talked about the physical tools of yoga. Now let's move inward to the breath, pranayama. This is essential for both yoga and mindfulness. We start with the basics. Inhale, breathing in, as in inhale deeply through your nose. Exhale, breathing out. Exhale slowly to release tension.
The foundation.
And then we have specific techniques like Ujjayi breath, that soft oceanic sound. Ujjayi breath keeps me calm during practice. And alternate nostril breathing, Nadi Shodhana, where you breathe through one nostril at a
Help your
time.
balancer.
I do alternate nostril breathing to clear my mind.
For those who are maybe a little more experienced, did you know that Ujjayi breath, with that slight constriction in the throat, can actually stimulate the parasympathetic nervous system?
No, I didn't.
Yeah, it promotes relaxation. It's like a little science hack within the practice.
That's really interesting. Speaking of clearing your mind, let's talk about mindfulness and meditation.
Perfect segue.
Mindfulness is simply paying attention to the present moment. You could say, mindfulness helps me stay focused at work. Meditation is the practice of cultivating that stillness or focus.
It's the how-to, right?
I meditate for 10 minutes every morning. Sometimes a mantra helps, a repeated word or phrase, like peace.
Gives the mind something to anchor to.
Exactly. My mantra today is peace. And a great way to become aware of your body is the body scan. You focus on each part, noticing any sensations.
Bringing awareness to the physical.
The body scan made me aware of my tight shoulders.
And what's fascinating is how these practices, which seem so simple, have such deep effects on us mentally and emotionally.
They really do.
And in terms of the philosophy, we have the chakras, those energy centers in the body.
Like the root chakra, the heart chakra.
Exactly, the crown chakra. And, practitioners often talk about balancing them.
Yeah, I've heard that.
I'm working on balancing my heart chakra. And then there's namaste, the greeting and closing.
The light in me honors the light in you.
Exactly. We end class with namaste. It's so peaceful. And then there's dharma, which is like your unique path in life.
Right.
Yoga can really help people connect with that sense of purpose.
That makes sense.
Yoga helps me connect with my dharma. And lastly, savasana.
The final resting pose, corpse pose.
That blissful ending to a class.
It's the best.
Savasana is my favorite part of class. So many people say that. Okay, so now we have a solid vocabulary base. Let's look at how you actually use these words in conversation.
Let's master some key phrases. Like, how do you even start a conversation about this stuff?
Okay, so to start a conversation, you could say something like, have you ever tried yoga? I started last month and I love it. Or, what do you think about mindfulness? It's been a game changer for me.
Yeah, or maybe, I went to a yoga class yesterday. Want to hear about it?
Exactly. And when you're describing your own practice, you might say, I usually do a 30-minute flow with lots of sun salutations. Or, my favorite pose is downward dog because it stretches everything.
Or, I meditate before bed to wind down. It helps me sleep.
And don't be afraid to ask questions. Which yoga style do you prefer? Hatha, vinyasa, or something else? Or, how do you stay mindful during a busy day?
Yeah, those are great questions.
Have you tried any breathing exercises like Ujjayi?
I love that one.
Oh.
And sharing the benefits is a great way to connect with others too. Yoga makes me feel so flexible and strong. Mindfulness reduces my stress. It's like a mental reset. After meditation, I feel so calm and clear-headed.
Exactly. And if you want to invite someone to join you, you could try, want to join me for a yoga class this weekend? I'm hosting a mindfulness session, care to come? Or even, let's try a guided meditation together on YouTube.
I love that. Now, you mentioned something earlier about cultural nuances. Can you talk about that a little bit more?
Oh yeah, that's crucial, especially as yoga and mindfulness have evolved in English-speaking countries.
So true.
So take yoga in the West. In places like the US and the UK, it's often viewed through a fitness lens, you know? You hear about power yoga and hot yoga.
Oh yeah, I burned so many calories in hot yoga today.
Mhm.
Or power yoga is intense. I'm sore, but energized.
Exactly. And that can be quite different from the traditional emphasis on balance and inner peace.
For sure. So when you talk about yoga, be mindful of whether your audience is interested in the physical benefits or the deeper, spiritual aspect.
Exactly. Tailor your language. Now, mindfulness has also become super popular, and apps like Headspace and Calm have played a big part in that.
Oh, for sure.
People might say, I use Headspace for a quick mindfulness break, or Calm sleep stories are my go-to at night. It's also become closely tied to self-care, so you'll hear things like, I'm taking a mental health day, or I'm practicing gratitude.
Those are good ones.
Yeah, and being aware of these trends helps you connect mindfulness to everyday life. Now, what about etiquette?
Oh yeah, that's important.
Like in yoga classes, there are a few things to keep in mind. Silence during the practice is usually appreciated. Save the chit-chat for before or after.
Makes sense.
And while knowing the Sanskrit names is great, most people will use the English terms for the poses.
That makes it easier for everyone.
And generally, a positive and encouraging tone is best. Saying yoga is hard might get a sympathetic nod, but saying, I hate meditation might not go over so well.
Probably not. So now that we have a vocabulary and some phrases, how can we structure a conversation so it flows naturally?
Okay, good question. So start with something that piques interest. Maybe, I just tried this new yoga pose. Have you heard of crow pose?
Or, mindfulness has really changed my morning routine. What's yours like?
Exactly. Then share your own experience, make it personal. Crow pose was tricky, but I held it for a few seconds. Or, I like to sit by the window, close my eyes, and just focus on my breath.
That's nice.
Then, invite the other person in. What's the most challenging pose you've tried? Or, do you have a favorite mindfulness practice?
And then, build on what they say. So if they say, I love tree pose, it's so calming, you could respond with, oh, tree pose is great. Do you find it helps with your balance?
Exactly. And then wrap up on a positive note, something like, this chat's inspired me to practice more, thanks. Or, let's talk about mindfulness again soon. It's fascinating.
Those are really helpful tips. Now, can we walk through some common situations where these conversations might come up?
Sure, let's do that. So imagine you're at a yoga class. You might greet the instructor, hi, I'm new here. What can I expect from today's class? Or chat with other students. That was a workout. How long have you been practicing yoga? And if you need help, don't hesitate to ask. Could you show me how to adjust my position in Warrior 2?
Yeah, asking for help is so important.
It is. Now, with friends, it might be more casual. I went to a yoga class yesterday. My legs are still wobbly. Or it could be a deeper conversation. Mindfulness really helps me when I'm anxious. What helps you cope with stress?
Those are good examples. What about at work or school?
Well, in the break room, you might hear someone say, I did a quick meditation at lunch. It was so refreshing. Or in a group discussion, yoga has really helped me focus. Has anyone else tried it?
I could see that happening.
And online, there are endless possibilities. You might comment on a post. I loved your post about staying consistent with mindfulness. Any tips? Or share your own experience. Just finished an energizing vinyasa flow. Feeling amazing. What's your go-to practice?
So many ways to connect.
Exactly. Now remember, you want to adapt your tone to the situation.
So true. Okay, so we're feeling more confident with the basics. How can we take it to the next level?
Okay, so to expand your skills, try using idioms and expressions. Instead of saying you feel calm, say yoga helps you find your zen. Yoga helps me find my zen after a hectic day.
That's a good one.
Or if you're really focused during meditation, you were in the zone. I was totally in the zone during meditation today. And when a pose is challenging, you're stretching your limits. Crow pose really stretches my limits.
Love those.
Descriptive adjectives can also help you paint a picture. Instead of good class, maybe it was invigorating. The class was so invigorating, I'm hooked. Or a meditation session was serene. Meditation always feels so serene, a peaceful escape.
Those are great.
And for a tough pose, call it challenging. That arm balance was challenging but rewarding.
I like that. What about connecting ideas in a sentence?
Connectors, they smooth out the flow. Like, I start with breathing exercises, then move into standing poses. Mindfulness helps me sleep, plus it boosts my mood. Yoga improves my flexibility, although it takes practice to see progress.
Those are so helpful. Now, what about common challenges like pronunciation?
Yes. Sanskrit words like pranayama and asana can be tricky.
They can.
A good tip is to break them down into syllables and use online resources to hear the correct pronunciation.
Good tip.
And with English words, pay attention to the stress. It's mindfulness, not mindfulness.
Right.
Now, confidence can be a hurdle.
That can be for anything, really.
It really can. If you're shy, start small. Talk to yourself in a mirror or describe your practice to your pet. I really enjoyed how open my hips felt after that stretch. Then gradually start talking to others.
Good advice. And remember, mistakes are okay. Everyone makes them.
They really are. And native speakers will appreciate your effort. What if you don't know what to say next in a conversation?
Oh, that happens to me sometimes.
To me too. Ask open-ended questions. What's your favorite part of yoga? How did you get into mindfulness? Share personal stories. The first time I tried tree pose, I wobbled like crazy. It was hilarious.
I love those kinds of stories.
Yeah.
And what about accents?
Well, English is spoken all over the world, so you'll hear variations.
Yeah, sure.
An American might say yoga mat differently than someone from the UK.
Right.
The key is exposure. Watch videos or listen to audio from different English-speaking regions.
Great advice. Can we delve deeper into some specific topics, like different types of yoga?
Sure. So, Hatha yoga. It's slower, gentler, often recommended for beginners. Hatha is a great starting point, very calming. Vinyasa is all about flowing movements synchronized with the breath.
The flow.
Exactly. I enjoy Vinyasa because it keeps me moving and I love the connection with my breath. Then you have Ashtanga, more structured and intense, builds strength and stamina.
That one's a challenge.
Ashtanga can be quite challenging, but it builds strength quickly. And then there's yin yoga, with those long, passive stretches that target the deeper tissues.
Oh yeah, that one's great for stress relief.
It is. I find yin yoga so helpful for melting away tension.
What about different mindfulness techniques?
Okay, so breath awareness is simply focusing on your breath as it goes in and out. Breath awareness is a simple but powerful way to be present. Then there's gratitude practice, taking time to appreciate what you're thankful for. Noting down 3 things I'm grateful for each day has really lifted my mood. And walking meditation, mindfulness in motion. You pay attention to the sensations of walking.
I like that one.
I tried walking meditation in the park. It was grounding and peaceful. Now, when you talk about benefits, you can categorize them. Physical benefits, since starting yoga, my posture has improved and my arms are more toned. Mental benefits, mindfulness has sharpened my concentration. And emotional benefits, meditation helps me navigate tough days with more ease.
Those are great examples. Can we do some practice dialogues?
Sure. Let's say you've just finished a yoga class. You could say to a friend, "Wow, that was intense. What did you think?" Your friend might reply, "I really enjoyed it, especially those warrior poses." Then you could say, "Me too. Warrior 2 really challenges my balance. What's your favorite pose?" They might say, "Probably child's pose. It's so relaxing." And you could wrap up with, "Oh, I get that. It's like a mini retreat. Want to grab some tea and chat."
I love that. What about introducing mindfulness to a colleague?
You could start by asking, "Have you ever looked into mindfulness?" They might say, "I've heard of it, but I'm not really sure what it is." You could explain, "It's about paying attention to the present moment without judgment. I sometimes do a body scan at my desk to refocus. Have you tried anything like that?" They might say, "No, that's new to me, but it sounds interesting. How do you even begin?" You could suggest it's simple. Just focus on your breath for a minute or two. Want to try it now?
What about an online chat?
You could say, "I loved your post about your yoga practice. What style do you usually do?" They might reply, "Thanks. I'm really into Vinyasa. It's so dynamic and flowing." And you could say, "That's great. I prefer Hatha. I like the slower pace. How long have you been practicing?" They might say, "About a year now. What about you?" And you could reply, "I'm a little newer. About 6 months. Maybe we could swap tips sometime."
Those are really helpful examples.
Remember, they're just starting points. Practice speaking out loud and make the phrases your own.
So how can we keep learning and growing?
Okay, so for ongoing learning, listen to English language podcasts like the Yoga Podcast or talks on TED Talks. Notice how the speakers describe sensations and benefits.
Great resources.
Joining communities is helpful too. Attend English-speaking yoga classes or join online forums like those on Reddit. Don't hesitate to ask questions. I'm finding pigeon pose tough. Any tips for tight hips?
It's all about community support.
It is. And after a conversation, reflect on how it went.
Yeah, like a little debrief.
Jot down some notes. What felt easy? What could be improved? Did you stumble on pranayama, but felt good describing your experience in tree pose?
Self-reflection is key.
It is. And make expanding your vocabulary a habit. Learn one new word a day, like equanimity, which means calmness and composure, especially during tough times. You could say, meditation helps me cultivate equanimity.
Wow, this has been such a thorough deep dive, from the origins of yoga and mindfulness to specific poses, breathing techniques, philosophical ideas, and practical conversation strategies.
We've covered a lot.
We have. You should feel ready to discuss these practices in English with confidence.
We hope so. Remember, learning a language is a journey, much like yoga or mindfulness.
So true.
Keep practicing, start with simple phrases, pay attention to cultural cues, most importantly, keep practicing.
Yeah, and your words can not only deepen your own understanding, but inspire others and create connections.
On and off the mat.
Exactly. So here's a final thought. As yoga and mindfulness become more global, how do you think this is shaping the English language? What new terms or shifts in meaning might emerge?
It's something to ponder.
It really is. Thanks for joining us on the deep dive.
Thanks, everyone.